today we are joined with a very special guest, spiritual channel Paul Selig.
So for those of you who aren't aware of Paul's work, he's considered to be one of the foremost spiritual channels working today, one that we're a huge fan of his work and have many of his books. And in his breakthrough works of channeled literature, author and medium Paul has recorded an extraordinary program for personal and planetary evolution as humankind awakens to its own divine nature. So important, obviously, because that is the basis of pure existence. So today's conversation with Paul is all about how to create a reality in alignment with the true self, ultimately living a life of freedom. So welcome to Soul Conversations, Paul.
Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, for our viewers who are also fans of our podcast, you're probably familiar that we've had Paul on our podcast before, and that was such a wonderful episode. Definitely want to encourage you to watch or listen to that episode as well, on top of this one, as he goes into a lot of detail there too. But we're really excited to bring this topic into a hyper-focused time slot for you. And, Paul, I wanted to open this up a little bit differently than the way we did on our podcast, because this is something that kind of I think is confusing in this whole throwing around the words create your own reality, right? So we've noticed that the phrase create your own reality can often be heavily misunderstood in any community, even the spiritual communities. And it's often limited to its superficial meaning of simply taking action, making choices to create specific outcomes and consequences, which undoubtedly, obviously has a component, is a component in creating a reality. Yeah. But through your work, this phrase has a much deeper and profound meaning. So what does it really mean to create your reality?
No, I'm a channel and I take dictation. So there's these guides teach through me and I can interpret their teachings as best I can. And I'll try to. The guides don't really talk much about creating your own reality. That's not their phrase. They actually correct the idea. They actually talk about being in vibrational accord with everything. So your consciousness, your vibrational field is in agreement to everything that you see, which means accord, vibrational accord, which is the idea of like attracts like. So people get caught up in, I want to manifest this, I'm going to manifest that, I'm going to create this, create that. And I think what they're missing the point is they're already in agreement with everything that they've created. Now, I'm not a very good New Ager. And I don't want people to say, why did I create this? Why did I, I think we learn through everything that we encounter. I think everything can be an opportunity to learn if it's chosen to be perceived as a productive experience, not necessarily a comfortable one. But I think what people miss is that we're also operating in a collective field. So, the guides would say, you didn't create the war in the Middle East. That would be rather narcissistic and grand, who the hell am I? But they say you are in accord with it because it's in accord with the level of consciousness you hold. And this is through the collective. And how you hold anything in consciousness, they say, informs the object. So they give these examples at times of, they talk about lifting things to, they call it the upper room or a higher octave of expression. And they say you can't lift the evil man to the upper room because you've aligned to him as evil. And if you've done that, you're operating at that level of, congruence or accord. Now, when the guides say accord, they'll often say it accord A-C-C-O-R-D, or they'll say A-C-H-O-R-D, as on a piano. And what they're talking about is tone. So the guides say that the collective, we, all of us, are operating in a collective field or an octave. And they say an octave has high and low notes. And they say any piece of music can be played in any octave above and beyond the one it's knowing itself in. And they talk about transposing, or re-knowing what has been known in one way in a higher way. And they talk about that as a form of alchemy. But that's when you start claiming or creating at a higher level, because the level of consciousness that you're holding isn't confirming all the old crap. The problem with everybody wanting to create stuff, and this is just my opinion, is everybody's busy creating what they think they're supposed to want or have. You know what I mean? And then you end up perpetuating these ideas of what success means or what beauty is or what should be aspired to. And, I don't know that any of that has any real truth, except that we can learn through all these things. I can learn through, being a very poor man or a very wealthy man. I've been poor. I know the lessons I learned. I've had some money. I've learned those lessons too. The guides say it's we who make one higher than the other. So the guides say there's nothing wrong with having the big house on the hill. Somebody gets to live there. But they do say, why do you want it? And that level of inquiry is often bypassed or missed in the rush to get. And people sometimes think that spirituality is about, having some brochure to how to get all the stuff of the world. And I think, well, you'll learn through getting the stuff, and then you learn that that's transient as well. It's not who you are. It's not going to give you what you thought you wanted in likelihood. And you learn that by sort of realizing that it didn't solve all your problems to get the thing that you thought would. So the guides say, you can have the house on the hill, but if you want it so that you can be the envy of your neighbors, you're creating in fear. And they say the action of fear is to claim more fear. And they say, look at every choice you ever made. Because you were afraid and see what it got you, and more than likely you'll find out that, you got more fear on the other end of that. So we are always creating. That's what I think people miss. The consciousness that we hold is always affirming our idea of myself, ourselves. You understand this? So if I want to complain about being single, which I do, I'm confirming an idea about myself. And the universe is essentially giving me back what I expect, what I anticipate. The guides say we're always ordering off of the menu of what we think that we're allowed. And the small self, which is the personality structure, only knows itself through historical data. What he or she's been told to want, aspire to, what the culture says you should be, what your parents say you must be, all of those things. And as long as we're just creating from that, I suspect that we're in this sort of miserable shell game, of trying to find the happy underneath the right shell. And I don't know that that's how it necessarily comes. Long answer.
And from what I understand too, let's say, for example, you use the example of I'm single. Right there, that's a fact. I am single. But it's depending on the way in which we wish to perceive the truth behind I am single varies from the way in which we're also vibrating in accordance to the perceivable reality. So for example, your I am single might have like infinite layers of ways to perceive what that actually means, depending on your internal community or structure. Does that make sense?
Kind of. I mean, I think it all does have to do with how we endow things with meaning and the narratives that we attach to things, and something is good or something is bad. Now, I mean, the guides speak about the true self, and the true self, they say, is the self that exists beyond personality, beyond age, beyond gender, ethnicity, or religion, the eternal self. There's an aspect, the guides say, of each of us that already knows who he or she is. And that's the aspect that they are working with us on aligning to. But I suspect my guides would say, the true self isn't single. It doesn't even operate at that level. But my personality self has all of these mandates of what a relationship should be or who I should be to attract these things. So I think, quite simply, I'm calling to myself what I expect to have. That's the simple way that the math works. And a lot of these, things are unconscious. I think that we assume things about ourselves and then look to the world to make those things true. The world does become a mirror of our ideas of self and our ideas of narrative. The guides say, there's one note playing in the universe. It's just one note, and all that one note is being played out in all these different manifestations. And when they talk about reality, they talk about reality being as like the paint on the canvas that, without pigment, And without form, attached has no meaning. So if you look at a beach scene, it's a bunch of paint that has been colored in different ways and then depicted to represent different things. And then we endow those things with meaning. Oh, what a pretty tree, what a pretty beach, what a beautiful sunset, what a horrible event. But finally, it's just this one thing playing out in different ways, and we've codified all this stuff with narrative. And some of what they're doing with us, I suspect, if I'm understanding the teachings correctly, is they're bringing us back to a place of awareness of source. The guides have said, the only real problem humanity faces is the denial of the divine or God or source, whatever you want to call it. Because you don't kill what you know is holy. And, you don't deny others their right to be if you know that you have the right to be at that level. It's all the sort of the denial of God, which plays out as separation. And that's our struggle. So, yeah, I think the meaning piece is important because we're taught what things should mean. And then we attach to that and we give it weight and prominence. And sometimes when we let go of what the meaning is, we can actually see what's really there.
And through the separation, we kind of had this distinguishing factor that you talked about, the small self and the true self, right? And so the small self being our limited perspective, us putting ourselves in boxes. And, why do you think that's, been like that? I mean, of course, we can talk about our parents, our teachers, and all of that, and possibly attribute that to separation and all the things that we go through on this ego journey. But why do you think that is, and how can we create maybe a life or live in accordance to our true self
without the box?
Without the boxes.
I mean, that's what the guides are teaching, and it's a challenge for me, and I'm not saying I understand it perfectly or can demonstrate it perfectly. I'm better with it than I used to be, and I do know that. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with what they call the small self. I think it's used in commerce. It's how we, sort of negotiate a reality and how we show up for work and all of those things. There's a place for it. I think the challenge is that we've come to believe that that's who we are at the cost of the other. And I heard when I was probably your age, when I was a kid, not that you're kids, but I was a kid to me in retrospect, and I was struggling, and I was just opening up as a channel, and I'm 99% sure that I heard this in channel because I wrote it down on a piece of paper and I stuck it in a book because I didn't understand it. I might have been 33 years old the most. And I heard freedom will come when the throne relinquishes its king. And I didn't know what the hell that meant, but I get it now. And basically, it's who's sitting in the throne, who's running the show. Is it the small self who runs a small kingdom? And my small self wants his way now, and everything should adhere to my idea of what reality is supposed to be to give me what I think I'm supposed to have. Or is it the true self, which they would call the eternal self or the divine self? The divine self, which is the inner light or the God within, you can call it anything you want. I think there's a name for it in most traditions. And I don't think it's a religious term. The true self aligns to the truth in all things. The divine within perceives the divine in all manifestation. And that's the higher level of alignment. The guides call it the kingdom. And they say the kingdom is the awareness of the inherent divine in all things. They say you can't make anything holy. It already is, but you can deny it. And that's the separation we experience. And that actually, I suspect, begins with ourself. If I choose to deny the inherent divinity of my body, which I've done most of my life, the natural expression of that is to deny the divine in everything else in form. How can you claim the ocean is holy if you've denied the holiness of your own form? Or the God as the sky, or God as the sea, or God as the mud on your feet. The guides have said, we've lived with this paradigm for so long that if there is a God or something like a God, it's up there in the clouds and we're stuck here in the mud, that we've forgotten that God is also the mud. And that's when we begin to have a translated experience of reality beyond this idea of separation. I understand from as little as I understand it through the teachings that have come through is we're the ones who claim separation. And this is an opportunity to learn, and we can learn through this all we want to. But I also get that, our belief in separation has come to the point where, we've actually claimed the means for our own self-destruction, which is an act of fear. And the guides say, to think that a bomb is going to keep you safe is an act of insanity, because that's not what bombs are meant to do. And I hear and I understand that we're sort of being called to a reclamation of who and what we are in a higher way. And this is the beginning of something quite remarkable. And I think what we're seeing around us right now is the teetering of the structures that we've known ourselves through, that were perhaps built and heavily informed by fear. And the guides said in their first book 10 years ago, they said, humanity is at a time of reckoning. And they said a reckoning is if the facing of oneself and all of one's creations. And what's been created in fear needs to be recreated and reknown in a higher way. And because of that, I think it's kind of messy, and maybe for a while, but hopefully we move beyond this way of denying the inherent worth of other human beings, which is what we've done, and denying the inherent divinity in nature and all things. So that's how I understand it.
And we're certainly at undoubtedly at a time right now where there is this paradigm shift. But again, we talked about this with one of our guests the other day. The pimple has to pop, the chaos has to ensue, things have to bubble up to the surface so that we can see it all and look it straight in the eye and say, okay, what are we going to do? What decision are we going to make? What choices are we going to make from this point forward to align with a new reality or live in accordance to our truth?
Exactly. Yeah.
How might it feel, or actually, let me rephrase this question. If someone were wanting to explore what it might feel like to live in alignment with more of their truth day by day, as we know it's a process, or has been a process, that's a box too, claiming that it's difficult or hard or this or that. What might that look like for someone to begin aligning with that true self?
To begin, that's an interesting question. I think to begin is to conceive that it's even possible. That's the first step, because I hear nothing can be claimed until it's first claimed as a possibility. We don't claim what we don't think we can have. I was raised an atheist, so I didn't have permission to believe in anything much until I started to look out of sheer necessity, and then I got met. So my willingness to look was the permission that was needed. A very simple thing that people can do is look for the inherent divine in what they see before them. See the God, or whatever you want to call it, in others. I learned that back in old 12-step land. They used to say, look for the good or the God in everybody. And that was revolutionary to me, but it worked. And it was a good first step for me in an awareness of spirit. And the other thing that the guides teach all the time, and I take it seriously, they say that the action of fear is to claim more fear. And that every choice we make in fear gets us more of the same. And a simple thing to begin to do is begin to look at how one is choosing and to not choose in fear. And then see what the ramifications are. Because if you're not choosing in fear, you're not claiming it, you're not aligning to it. It goes back to that whole teaching of accord. And the guys say everything, we see, we're in accord with, we're shaking hands with it. If you don't want to shake hands with it, you have to let it go. And then you can receive what's higher. Okay, so that's a start.
And funnily enough, it can be fear. You might be afraid of making a choice out of fear, or to change the fact that you're making choices in fear. Like the other option might sound fearful to our logical mind, when our heart and our soul might be guiding us towards that heart-based decision versus the fear-based decision, yet some anxiety may come up in that process. And so how would someone even distinguish between making fear-based decisions and the fear that may come from breaking fear-based cycles?
Well, I think I understand from the guides that when one is in one's knowing, true knowing, one is never afraid. And they talk about the difference between thinking and knowing. And basically they say there's nothing wrong with thinking, but when you think, you don't know. And the difference is when you're in your knowing, and just think of any time in your life when you really knew something. I knew I was in love. I knew I got the job. I knew the relationship was over. I knew they weren't going to live for long. Anytime you really knew something, there was no question attached. None. You knew. And I understand that when we're in our knowing, we're being invited to act on that. So I do understand the challenges of walking through fear. I do it all the time. And I'm a frightened man by nature. I'm the kid that, hid behind the lockers in gym class. I mean, I just didn't want to go, That part of me is still present. But I've learned to show up anyway as best I can. And acting in the face of fear is indeed courage, or you can say it's faith if you wish. But those debates, I think, are normal debates that one goes through. When people first realize that thought is creative, people get frightened of their own thinking. And, oh my God, I don't want to create from this. And I think that that's a stage somebody goes through and then hopefully moves past it. It's not about magical thinking. It is about sort of accountability to how one is operating in the world, and not that much more.
And that knowing just translates to this intuition, right? Just continuing to tap into our intuition day after day after day. And it just becomes easier. But at the same time, you're still going through these processes. And I can speak for myself and all of the fear that's come up, especially over the past year, more so than I think I've ever experienced. But it's almost liberating when you start to choose in choice of the intuition or follow that intuition. It's liberating. It feels so much better.
Well, and those moments of fear offer opportunity to show ourselves where we might be limited in our thinking or our beliefs and our blocks. And so it could be a teacher as long as we don't cling to it.
Absolutely.
You spoke earlier about co-creating in the collective. So from what we understand, when we do our individual part, we begin to resonate with the frequencies in which the collective is also vibrating in accordance with that same frequency. So as you change your internal self, you begin to see the community around you also shifting. How could we take that a step further, if there's even a step further, I don't know, to assist each other on this journey of co-creating this collective experience?
I mean, the guides teach this, and it's what they're really teaching now. I mean, the books that they write they're not really self-help books. They're really about sort of acclimating to your own true nature and then expressing it. But the purpose of that expression isn't to sort of get a bunch of stuff. It's to really transform the reality that you've known yourself through, and that's inclusive of others. So they talk about lifting to what they call the upper room, which is another strata of vibration, and they teach us how to do that. And then they basically say you become the doorway or the portal to it through what you encounter, not you at a personality level, but your vibrational field. So the one that's walking around vibrating like that is actually lifting what he or she encounters to that level through entrainment or vibrational accord. And you do this quite simply. I mean, the guides say it this way, that, what you damn damns you back, and what you bless blesses you in return. And to perceive the inherent divinity in anyone or anything, regardless of how they present, and that's the big challenge, is to lift them, to lift them to their true nature. One of the attunements that the guides work with in many of their books is the attunement. And an attunement basically is like tuning the radio station that we are to play a higher broadcast. They speak of this as being said by the true self. And the claim is, I know who I am in truth. I know what I am in truth. I know how I serve in truth. I am free. I am free. I am free. And the guides say it's always true, because what is true at that level is always true. And it's always true for everybody. So I can claim this for you just as well. I know who you are in truth. I know what you are in truth. I know how you serve in truth. You are free, you are free, you are free, which is, again, tuning the radios that you are to acknowledge the higher broadcast that's always present from that part of you. It's not fixing anybody. It's not overriding their free will. It's simply a recognition of the inherent divine and the action of the divine that must be present when one is claimed as such.
I've even incorporated that
Me
attunement
too.
into my, I had our first baby. He's 3 months old this week, actually. And I've incorporated that attunement into his nighttime lullaby.
That's like,
It feels good to share that space with him. And it reminds me, too, of who and what I am in truth, as I see him as who and what he is in truth. And it's a freeing feeling.
Well, and even from an outsider's perspective of witnessing something happening at a grocery store or something and seeing an argument ensue or seeing some unpleasant thing happening.
Unpleasant, yeah.
Yeah, unpleasant. Claiming that and saying those words, I've found myself repeating that. I mean, the Book of Freedom was really transformative for both of us. And, now with, your new one out, realization beyond the known and channeled text. I mean, it feels like you're being lifted. It's an activation of sorts. And I know when both of us have read your texts and through the guides and this work, you feel like you're being activated on a cellular level.
Sometimes we even have to put the book down for a few weeks as our bodies adjust to recalibrate. Even if we don't understand something that we read in an entire chapter, you still feel this uplifting.
Yeah. The guides say that the books operate on 2 levels. They're the words on the page, which provide context, but the real book is the energetic transmission, the dialogue with the reader. So that's why people feel all this stuff and have these experiences, as I understand it.
Well, Paul, we want to encourage viewers, obviously, to really dive into these books and soak it up, enjoy the material, and receive the activations too. Do you have any updates or any work that now that we move into 2020, that you'd like to share with our viewers?
I'm channeling online most Wednesday nights. I do a live stream and the guides are lecturing and taking questions. So that information's on my website, which is just my name. It's Paul Selig, PaulSelig.com. I'm doing workshops all over the country and around the world. So I'm often in somebody's neighborhood if you want to work with the guides and work with the energy that they bring through in person. There's ample opportunity. And the next book comes out in August, which is called Alchemy, which is the second book in this series. So those are the updates.
That's
wonderful.
Exciting.
Well, I'm really excited for that to come out. And I know last time we spoke on the podcast that we try to get to one of your in-person channelings. I know that's something that Sarah and I both are really wanting to do at some point. So 2020, we can
hopefully see you in person.
Definitely make that happen.
I'd love it.
Well, thank you so much again for your time and sharing the wisdom of the guides. And we really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. Be well.
Thank you.
Too.